What surprised me most was how quickly a single misunderstanding between faith groups can escalate into something much larger, sometimes even violence. That's why I think the stakes for genuine dialogue are higher than ever.
If you look at recent data, Pew Research found that over a quarter of global conflicts in the last decade had a religious dimension. That's not just a statistic, it's a warning sign about the cost of failing to communicate across belief systems.
But what if the real obstacle isn't just disagreement, but fear? People often hesitate to engage with other faiths because they worry about losing their own identity or being misunderstood. Isn't that a bigger barrier than doctrine itself?
Here's the takeaway. When dialogue happens, it doesn't erase differences, but it does build a kind of trust that makes escalation less likely. I've seen communities where just a few shared meals between leaders changed the whole tone.
There's also a psychological benefit studies show that exposure to diverse perspectives can reduce anxiety and even lower prejudice. It's not just about avoiding conflict, it's about improving mental well-being and social cohesion.
Still, how do you make these conversations accessible? If most dialogue happens among elites or in academic settings, what about ordinary people who feel left out or unheard?
That's a crucial point. For dialogue to matter, it has to reach beyond formal panels and into neighborhoods, schools, even workplaces. Otherwise, the impact stays limited to headlines instead of daily life. Only after 2 iterations we realized that inviting leaders from different faiths to co-organize a food drive actually shifted the conversation from doctrine to shared action. That's where the bridge started to feel real, not just theoretical.
That's a strong point. In a 2022 Pew survey, over 70% of respondents from diverse religious backgrounds identified community service as a core value. It suggests that practical collaboration, like your food drive example, can reveal authentic overlap, even when theological differences remain.
But can we be sure that focusing on these overlaps doesn't risk flattening out what makes each tradition unique? If everyone just rallies around charity, do we lose the depth of difference that actually matters to people?
Here's the takeaway. Bridge building isn't about erasing difference. It's about finding a platform where distinct voices can contribute without feeling diluted. The food drive worked because each group brought its own rituals and language to the table.
And there's evidence that such pluralistic approaches foster respect. For instance, interfaith conferences that include structured dialogue rather than just joint activities tend to report higher satisfaction among participants, according to the Interfaith Youth Course 2021 report.
Still, I wonder if the idea of a universal common ground is itself a bit contentious. What if some communities feel that their core values aren't represented in these shared spaces? Isn't there a risk that the loudest or most mainstream values dominate?
That's why intentional design matters. Setting up ground rules so that every tradition's priorities are voiced without forcing consensus keeps the bridge sturdy. Authentic common ground isn't about uniformity. It's about mutual recognition. Only after 2 iterations we realized how deeply some misconceptions are rooted not just in individuals, but in entire communities. For example, the assumption that engaging in interfaith dialogue means compromising your own beliefs can be a huge barrier.
That's a critical point. Pew Research data from 2019 showed that nearly 40% of respondents believed interfaith events could threaten their religious identity. This perception often stems from a lack of exposure or education about other faiths, which media coverage sometimes amplifies.
But isn't it possible that some of these fears are reinforced by past negative experiences? If a community once felt misrepresented or dismissed, why would they trust the process again without strong assurances?
Here's the takeaway. Trust doesn't build overnight. I've seen cases where a single, honest conversation where both sides admit their fears can start to shift the dynamic. But it takes consistent effort, not just one-off events.
Education systems can play a role here. For instance, schools that incorporate comparative religion courses tend to produce students with more nuanced views. There's evidence from the UK that such curricula reduce stereotyping by about 20%.
If that's true, why do some communities resist these educational reforms? Is it just fear of the unknown? Or is there a deeper concern about losing cultural cohesion?
It's often both. Some leaders worry that opening up to dialogue might dilute traditions. But I've also heard stories where initial suspicion gave way to mutual respect. like the mosque and synagogue in Chicago that started joint service projects after years of avoidance.
Media portrayal can either bridge or widen these gaps. When coverage focuses on conflict rather than cooperation, it reinforces the idea that faiths are fundamentally incompatible. Balanced reporting is rare, but it's crucial.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized that the youth-led community center in Jakarta succeeded because it prioritized shared activities like neighborhood cleanups over theological debates. That shift made all the difference.
That's a great example. Data from the Tannenbaum Center shows that interfaith projects with a practical, service-oriented focus are 40% more likely to sustain participation over 2 years. It seems the common goal really anchors collaboration.
But if that's the case, why do so many initiatives stall when leadership changes? Is it just about the activities, or does it hinge on having a charismatic figure at the helm?
Leadership continuity is definitely a factor. In the Sarajevo Education Project, for instance, when the founding imam and priest both retired, participation dropped by half within a year. Structured handover plans could mitigate that.
Here's the takeaway. Projects that build in leadership succession and keep the focus on tangible outcomes like food banks or disaster relief tend to weather those transitions better.
Still, I wonder if these models can be scaled up. What works in a small town might unravel in a city with deeper divisions. Are there examples where local success actually rippled out to broader change?
The Nairobi Peace Initiative comes to mind. After their Interfaith Sports League reduced neighborhood tensions, city officials adopted similar programs in 3 other districts. The key was adapting the model, not copying it wholesale.
So maybe the lesson is, start small, adapt relentlessly, and never underestimate the power of shared purpose to bridge divides. Only after 2 iterations, we realized that digital platforms can both connect and divide communities. The question is, how do we harness technology to deepen, not dilute, interfaith understanding?
A recent Pew Research Center study found that nearly 60% of young adults engage with religious content online, but only a fraction participate in structured interfaith forums. This suggests that while access is growing, meaningful dialogue still lags behind.
If we assume that online spaces are the future, what prevents them from becoming echo chambers? Isn't there a risk that algorithms reinforce existing biases, making genuine interfaith exchange harder?
That's a real concern. Here's the takeaway. Intentional design matters. Platforms need to prioritize exposure to diverse perspectives, perhaps through curated interfaith dialogues or partnerships with educational institutions.
Education systems play a pivotal role. For example, UNESCO's guidelines recommend integrating interfaith literacy into curricula, yet implementation varies widely. Without institutional support, grassroots efforts can only go so far.
But what about political manipulation? If leaders use religious identity for division, can community initiatives really counteract that? Or do we need broader policy changes?
Sustaining momentum means engaging both top-down and bottom-up. Community leaders can model respect, but systemic change requires policy shifts like protecting religious freedoms and supporting inclusive education.
Unresolved challenges remain, especially deep-rooted prejudice. Yet, the rise of youth-led interfaith projects, like virtual peace camps, shows that new forms of dialogue are emerging, often outside traditional institutions.
If you're listening, consider this. Fostering interfaith understanding isn't just for experts or officials. Each of us can start a conversation, challenge a stereotype, or support inclusive initiatives. The future depends on collective action, yours included.